So the next session is SMW Conversation, Steps Towards Decarbonizing the Global Maritime Supply Chain. So just a reminder again, Pigeonhole will be used for that. So enter your event code SMW 2022 and you'll be able to ask your questions and you'll be able to vote for your questions as well. And while we are refreshing the stage, just a reminder that this event is available on Swapcard. You can also have a look at the live occurrences in this ballroom also. So thank you very much for that. After this last panel for this session, our next, we will be having a break and followed by a 4 p.m. event that's happening. Check out your program sheet for more information. Looks like we are almost ready. So again, the next session is SMW Conversation, Steps Towards Decarbonizing the Global Maritime Supply Chain. Allow me to introduce our moderator. And to our friends who are at the back, feel free to look for a seat if you would like. Your session moderator is Rasmus Nagel, Managing Director, The Shipping Collective. And joining Rasmus on the panel, we have quite a few of our friends. Okay. Rasmus, when you're ready. Let's introduce you one by one, shall we? So our session moderator is Rasmus Nagel. Let's give him a big hand. Let's welcome Rasmus. He's the Managing Director of the Shipping Collective. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Joining Rasmus, we have, you may raise your hand and say hi when your name is called. We have Sarah Greenough, Head of Maritime Sustainability and Supply Chain Excellence, BHP. Let's welcome her, please, with a round of applause. Thank you. I know it's a little bit tough after lunch, but let's do something for them. And then let's welcome Peter Schellenberger, Managing Director, Vanir Marine, Vice President, Supply Chain, Thome Group. Let's welcome Peter, please. Peter. And then we have Mikkel Larsen, Chief Executive Officer, Climate Impact X. Let's welcome Mikkel. Thank you. And last but not least, let's welcome Thomas Knudsen, Managing Director, Toll Group. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause for our entire panel. Let's welcome them.
Yes, hello. Yeah, it's working. Hello, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to moderate and help and facilitate the discussion here on stage. I look very much forward to it. We have an interesting panel lined up for you with very different perspectives on the topic. So we'll be talking around what are the steps that we are taking to decarbonize with a perspective on the maritime supply chain. So we'll give a chance to each of the panelists to present themselves, where they're from and what particular perspective they bring into the conversation. So Sarah, should we start with you?
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me. My name is Sarah Greenough. I'm the Head of Maritime Sustainability at BHP. And I guess today I'm here bringing the perspective of the Charter out to the conversation. So thank you. I'll pass this.
Yeah, Peter Schellenberger, Vice President Supply Chain Thome and responsible for Vanir Marine. We're trying to do things a bit more digital, also in terms of supply chain sustainability things.
My name is Mikkel Larsen. I'm the Chief CEO for Climate Impact X. I should probably also say I'm yet another Dane here in this audience. There's a lot of us. So what we try and do is we try and help ambitious shipping companies to find solutions for that part of hard-to-abate emissions that they can't decarbonize completely right now. And the tool we do that with is carbon offsets.
And my name is Thomas Knudsen. I'm the Managing Director of the Toll Group. We're the largest transport and logistics company in Australia, but also we're a large global freight forwarder, so I guess I represent both the customer as well as the ends of the supply chain. And I'm actually Singaporean, even though I was born in Denmark.
You speak Danish, though, I understand. But just staying on you, Thomas, then, and working backwards to the panel, from your perspective and representing your customers, what are the main challenges, a couple of challenges that you see with the decarbonization agenda?
Well, Perhaps the positive to start with is actually that we're now having this conversation. So a couple of years ago, I think a lot of customers, it was the final point on a long meeting agenda, and it was more kind of checking the box. I think that's changed. So it's very positive that our customers are very engaged and interested in the decarbonization agenda. So I think that's a big plus. I think some of the challenges, and I'm curious to hear Mikkel's viewpoint, because I thought Bo and others were talking about it before, is data. So for us, shipping is scope 3. And because scope 3 is, we're focusing a lot on 1 and 2, but scope 3, we might have 25 shipping lines that we're dealing with and 25 airlines or more. How do we ensure that we can get the data in a standardized way where we can make sense of it so we can present that to our final customer as their scope 3, together with our own emissions that we produce through our supply chain. So I think data is a significant one. If I talk about it as a logistics supply chain company, our biggest problem now is we can't get access to equipment. So if you're looking at, I would like to buy some EVs, especially in the heavier segment of our trucks. First of all, they're not physically available in terms of we don't have the right technology now. Hydrogen is only coming online. So there's probably a journey of 5 to 10 years before we actually get access to the equipment, even if we wanted to buy it today. And that means a lot of our focus together with customers is how do we optimize our current diesel vehicles, our current warehouses, and so forth. So those are probably a couple of the big ones.
And Sarah, if you represent from BHP's and the charterers' perspective, what are your main challenges?
Yeah, I think as also mentioned in the previous panel, having alignment on real targets, regulated, and working towards those. I think also consensus on the future fuel of choice, and with that obviously comes additional challenges around infrastructure, cost, availability, volume, and timing. And then finally, I think, as was also mentioned last time, was cost appetite, and that balance between cost, risk, and price will be challenging.
Yeah. Maybe that's an area where you guys can come in and help, or how's that?
Sure, it could be. So in terms of where I see the, obviously it's obviously a price decision from many shipping companies. And the willingness to pay that extra amount just to decarbonize. So interesting enough, when we talk about carbon credits, most people think of it as only an extra cost. But what we're starting to see now is that it actually can be a source of revenue for some shipping companies. So some of the ambitious companies are starting to see that this creates a value proposition for them when they can offset their voyages to their customers, and there's a real demand from that by many customers. The other way, which is also interesting, is when you think about what the voluntary carbon market represents, it's a way to incentivize the decarbonization from acceleration of R&D. And so we're starting to see production of carbon credits, i.e. companies, shipping companies who take, for example, new anti-fouling, they actually generated income from that because they can generate carbon credits. So if you asked me a couple of years ago, how do you get the price of these things down, I would have said it would only be in terms of customers willing to pay more. We're also starting to see that there's new technologies that can generate income from shipping companies, and that's a relatively new thing.
Mm-hmm. Peter, then from your perspective, is that the opportunity that you guys are going for?
Absolutely, and I think where we are now is that we are trying to translate these buzzwords into granular decisions on the ground, and I think that's our challenge. From a ship management perspective, that means clearly solving this big spread that we have now between security aspects. We were facing a crisis, for example, with closed ports in China. So we have a multi-sourcing challenge all of a sudden. While we have been brainwashed for 20 years, Kaizen, go as lean as possible, all of a sudden we notice if we are dependent too much on one source, as the German automakers noticed when they had only one cable supplier from the Ukraine. So these are challenges that we have at this moment. We all engaged in ESG reports, probably for the first time the last 2 years, and now our challenge is to bring those thoughts to life, and they're very important. And what is our challenge is twofold in principle. It is internally to create the mindset change first, to create good arguments and business models and also return on investment models for the clients to understand that a safer world and a more resilient world to the new challenges will have a surcharge. As the colleague from Maersk said earlier on, he actually quantified it. Yeah, we are not able to do that yet, but we have a completely different approach where we have been trained to look at price as the first driver. And now, of course, sustainability is the new dogma. However, where is the willingness of the other people in the supply chain? We are a small gear in that big gearbox. So that means we first have to leave our silo and engage with our partners. For example, with forwarding companies. In the past, when we have run a tender, global tender for global freight forwarding, we would have compared prices and negotiated things around things. First of all, at the moment, you can't negotiate air freight prices. But secondly, at this moment, we can only consider partners that integrate with our systems, give us visibility, and they're also able to tell us for our internal supply chain needs, what is our CO2 footprint? And the additional request that creates a lot of headache is when we actually start to consolidate, how much do we save? These are things that we have to present to our clients, which is then again part of their ESG report. You know, so a lot of new challenges.
But so if the opportunity lies in, you know, putting an amount to the cost and the opportunity of carbon as an example, can we then get that into the same tender conversation together with the price of moving the cargo? Is that the opportunity?
Yeah, I think what is interesting is, and there is something going on in Ukraine right now, which is both having, you know, some really beyond just the catastrophe that it is, but how does that impact the global markets, right? But what we're seeing now is because the increasing price of fuel, the transition into solar in our sites, the transition into EV is actually becoming easier. So I think there is something there that says at our end, and it's not just toll, I can actually see that we can deliver lower cost, lower emissions products at some levels. That's not necessarily the case in the end-to-end supply chain. But I do think we have customers who are clear and saying, we understand the imperative here, we're willing to co-invest with you. We have a project in Australia we are running now on hydrogen between two sites where the customer also happens to be a supplier. So Viva Energy, they both sell us the fuel and we buy the fuel and move their fuel for them. And we're sitting down now and talking about how do we create a shared infrastructure where we buy trucks to move their product between two sites. And I think to the conversation before, if we can get into partnerships like that with customers where there's a shared interest in building infrastructure and then a longer term commitment, I think some of the investment up front, you might be funded through a longer term agreement with the customers. Let me be clear, not every customer is interested in that conversation, but I think it's starting to emerge with some customers, but certainly not all.
How do you guys see that, Sarah? I mean, is this an opportunity because the fundamentals have changed? Or?
I think picking up on the customer lens, certainly customers are more interested in how we operate rather than just what we produce. And I think we all have a responsibility now to, you know, put the business case for sustainability to our shareholders, the board, and our stakeholders. And I think also sustainable trade, you know, driven by technological innovation is certainly probably going to be one of our biggest challenges, but also opportunities, you know, in our time.
All right.
Maybe I'll just pick up on that and mention that it's obviously not just a customer-driven thing, it's also an investor-driven thing. So in my previous job, I was the Chief Sustainability Officer of DBS, and obviously financing there under the Poseidon Principle was a very big thing for us and for many other banks. So the desire to have companies decarbonize, shipping companies, as much driven by investors, you see them requiring that. So the logic comes from the fact that if I need to decarbonize my scope 3, it becomes someone else's scope 1, as you were mentioning before.
All right. Anything to add?
Yeah, what I would add is that we have this integration effect at this moment where we realize that every individual stakeholder also sitting here on the stage can only control a certain part of this. So What has changed in the last year, I would say, is that people are sitting together on tables, even competitors, which is quite interesting. And for the first time also, we consider data sharing within the necessities of competition and all things. So what I would say is that we should, and we do, make good use also of support that we get from international organizations, or also here being in Singapore from MPA, or we are very active in an activity called SG TradeX, where also, again, all the stakeholders for the first time sit together on the table and formulate their pain points. And I think that is a leverage to actually go the next step. It will be painful and will not be easy, but as long as people have the willingness and the realization that alone, no matter how big the individual company is, such as BHP, for example, but I think it is much more productive to sit together and formulate our needs.
So just before Thomas has an add-on.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, this collaboration point. I think I've followed the news around what Mikkel is doing, and I guess Carbon Place, which I guess is working with you, which is a number of banks who are coming together. And we in our industry almost look at every problem as something we have to compete over. And it could be that there's actually an opportunity to collaborate. So, you know, we do business with BHP, but we also do business with customer or competitors of BHP. Western Australia is a good example, right? Can you create joint infrastructure where you produce, where they collaborate as customers, or different trucking companies like Toll come together and collaborate to create infrastructure, rather than always looking at how do we beat each other, because that might actually be able to lift the game and grow infrastructure, right? So I think we might also have to shift our mindset in terms of competition and where we compete and where we don't.
So how do we align those incentives and create the environment for that? What needs to happen? Well,
I think what we're going through is a summary of small steps. I think we all think back now under this new mantra, and we see what are these little screws that we can turn on, you know, and it goes as small as, you may have followed yesterday, we've committed to trials to apply drones for deliveries to ships, you know, because it has a lower CO2 footprint than using barges, right? So also that is something that we have been involved in for about a year, and only now it's taking off. So I'm just saying, only the additional small steps will eventually make a difference later on.
So a little bit on those incentives. We have a question from the audience here around how companies will balance the higher costs with the need for sustainability, and what other factors besides price is slowing down the adoption of greener fuels. And we talk about that, you know, the lack of collaboration or the lack of incentives, but Sarah?
Yeah, I think building on the ecosystem effect, and certainly the announcements today on green corridors, and BHP is a big believer in that, and working with competitors, and you know, it's a different kind of relationship, and it's a different kind of world that we're moving into, and bringing, you know, the area's expertise to the table, the fuel providers, the charterers, you know, the infrastructure, it all is going to play part of this new world that we're living in, and then of course data sharing has to be a part of it.
Well, just to answer the specific question, and perhaps it's obvious, but there's a carrot and stick approach to these types of things here. So we start to see that carbon taxes make people make very, very different decisions right now, right? So internal carbon prices is one thing, but it's still voluntary. As we start to see, like Singapore's done, and you know, increase the carbon tax quite significantly, and it's happening, then you have the price dynamics to change significantly. I think what would be interesting to see what happens for international shipping companies is what's going to happen with cross-border, like the EU border tax and these types of things, but it will change the dynamics completely. So I'm beginning to become more of a believer that we need a little bit more stick, not just only carrot.
So maybe another question, a little bit related, and maybe back to Sarah, from a charterer's perspective, if the ship owner offered a green voyage and passed the cost of emission on, what price would be agreed for the value of the CO2? Can we get the price of the CO2 into the books and into the voyage consideration?
I think it starts with data. It starts with understanding, the emissions reduction of every voyage, having a transparent platform, and being able to share that data through the ecosystem. The cost, not so sure, but certainly traceability plays a big part in this. And green voyages, I think, will be a thing of every voyage in the future.
So if we had a dollar amount to a ton that I hear that you trust, so would you be able to translate that into the cost of your products?
I think it may get there in the end, not today, but maybe.
What about you, Thomas? You have many customers. How do you see that across that?
Well, it's clearly possible the way it is today to calculate a carbon footprint of a shipment. Therefore, if you have a price of it, you can put it forward. I guess the underlying question is, are people willing to pay for it? My view is that to Mikkel's question is, well, if you start getting penalties in there for not doing it, then that might be driving it. I met with an insurance company a couple of years ago, and they were talking about for Australia the cost of climate being $40 billion for insurance at that point. That's 2 years ago. I think we've all seen what happened in Australia. I'd be surprised over time if governments don't get to the point in realization that they need to penalize to drive this, and whether that's to generate revenue or to force a change. So I think it'll come naturally at that point. So it'll end up on the consumer's table at the end. That to me is clear. The question is just in which way we get there.
Yeah, I think some of the considerations that we see, of course, is also that a lot of the decision-making around supply chain will change in a sense that people will look at the value of the goods that are being shipped. You will wonder whether to ship rolls of toilet paper around the world makes a lot of sense, because that increased cost of transport has to be translated onto that. For high-value goods, it's maybe not so super difficult. But another thing is that the optimization cannot only take place on our side. For example, I was just told a very interesting figure. It is assumed that in average around the world, 24% of the container space that being shipped is empty. So if you look at that and the CO2 impact of that, also this part of the stakeholders, the optimization, the leverage of that is absolutely fantastic, right? So that is something that in first instance will eventually happen at the manufacturer side when you coordinate and combine it with packaging optimization and things like that, cartons in a box, but then also probably in the next stage that will be escalated to you, and we will start to think, given the container prices nowadays, how can we fill this almost quarter of a container in average, right?
I absolutely. I think we're all talking about, I think, hydrogen and ammonia and so on, but there's so much slack or waste in the supply chain today, certainly in the containerized business, right? And what opportunities can we drive to improve that? Whether that's backhaul shipments, whether it's better utilization of containers, whether better forecasting so you don't have the massive downfalls, the waiting time that ships have in ports, the waiting time the trucks have on the road. There's so much more we can do with existing technology of taking out waste. It's not easy, but it can be done.
So when it comes to the choice of fuels, and you touched upon that already. I mean, there's an argument that the greenest fuel is the fuel we don't use, but that we do have to use some, right? But what are the preferred fuels? Anything from you guys?
Yeah, so I think, BHP has certainly made inroads into using dual-fueled LNG vessels, and also inroads into biofuels, but obviously that's not the end game. And, I think we heard on the last panel we shouldn't look past good in the pursuit of perfection, and right here and now that's delivering abatement. But, longer term, obviously, green ammonia, green methanol, they're all part of the conversation, and there's lots of work to do before we get there, and obviously that's going to take a lot of people working together very hard over the next few years.
No, I just wanted to add a perspective on the ammonia. So, of course, to get these things onto market, it's very obvious that we cannot do it. It's just too expensive right now to have 100% of vessels on ammonia. Same way as in the airline industry, sustainable aviation fuels, it's just too expensive. So I think one way that we should start to think about this is what's the best way to on-ramp these things? And it has to be a blend. So rather than having 100% sustainable fuels, you got to blend that with something that makes it affordable for shipping companies. And this is again where I advocate for high quality carbon credits, because as you try and compensate for your entire voyage, you got to start up with a small amount of the very expensive stuff, the sustainable fuels, and a higher proportion of carbon credits, which immediately takes actions. And then over time, as we on-ramp them with lower R&D costs, that blend has to change so we get to 100% sustainable fuels. But if we never let the on-ramping happen and just waiting for the price to come down naturally, I think we missed the boat on climate change, sadly.
Another question here around funding, so external funding of energy efficient projects where the financier shares the energy savings is commonly used for buildings. Do you see this as a viable option for the shipping sector?
So at least what we're doing now, which has nothing to do with ships, but just to build on that, right, is that when we install solar panels on our buildings, that money is, that the upfront capex is paid for by a company, and they then get the return from the electricity and the carbon credits they push back in. So in principle, they get our roof for free. We might get some carbon credits or green energy in return for that. So we don't actually have to put up the capex. I think that's the point, and I don't know whether that can be applied to ships.
But I think also what this point is possibly referring to is there are financing companies that put up solar panels on companies' roof, and then they will earn, so they put them up for free, and then the difference in the energy bill then goes back as a payment to the company who provides the solar panel. It's probably slightly harder in the shipping sector, not to say that it's impossible, but I think the concept of generating carbon credit is probably more fitted here. There isn't the same, CapEx expense that you can do this with in the shipping center. But I guess in theory, I've never seen a company who do it in the same way as in the shipping sector, though.
Have you heard about it, Peter?
No. I think pertaining to, not to this one, pertaining to your earlier question, as far as a ship management company is concerned, it's all about providing a safe environment for the clients. So I think our challenge is, even though these new technologies are not already in place, we have to start preparing ourselves, and particularly the knowledge of our people on shore and on board for this. It's a little bit like paying forward, because at this moment we don't need it, but it will probably come faster than we think. So I think an agile company is well prepared for that, so that we are investing now at the moment a lot of money and time in dual fuel training, all kinds of propulsions where we have to be ready when the time comes.
So experiments, you talked about start small, experiment, creating an agile company, but maybe also an agile industry. So a question here around, what about reducing consumption? We talked about, better utilization of containers and so on, but consuming less and having better products so the consumers can also help with decarbonization. Can the industry also help educating on how to consume?
I don't know whether it's up to us to educate the consumer on what clothes to buy and from which companies they should buy it. But I absolutely agree with the point, right? In saying I think something has gone wrong, and now this is a personal viewpoint, but something has gone wrong over the last 30 years with globalization, where we buy stuff and we throw it away, and we do it very consistently, right? So the ultimate consumer, and we are all consumers, I think should think differently around how we do that. And that goes for what food we consume and where we buy that food from, and that whole thing. But is it the industry's role to educate the consumer on that? I think perhaps it's our role to educate them on the implications of it. But in principle, you're asking a shipping company to educate the final consumer not to buy the products that are filling their ships. I don't know whether ultimately most shipping companies would see that as a viable solution. But
So Peter, I think you brought this up in our pre-discussions a little bit of this around maybe also slightly different incentives here in terms of the changing sorts and patterns that we see, maybe creating full transparency, awareness around what's the actual CO2, consumption for getting a product from A to B and so on. Is there a problem here?
I think there is. So I used to work for Maersk a long time ago, and we made a calculation that it showed, I think it was at that point, a pair of running shoes, that the carbon footprint of moving a pair of running shoes from Vietnam to London, that the last 4 miles that a customer drove in their car to pick up those running shoes, the carbon footprint was bigger for those pairs of shoes. We've all started buying online. That carbon footprint has not necessarily gone down because it's been shipped by air from the US. Does the consumer fully appreciate how that supply chain has an impact on their carbon footprint? I'm not sure. Whether they care is a different question, but at least we could make it more clear to them. I think that's a good point.
I think what is also not transparent, but becomes more transparent as we dive deeper into this, is when you have the added carbon footprint of a finished product. You can look at an Airbus plane, right? How many times those things are being transported back and forth around the world before it's actually assembled. And if you would add up all these individual transport elements, then you will start to question how much sense that will make in the future if there's a price tag on it. So in that sense, I think the only thing that we can do is to make this transparent. That's probably our only role.
Just a couple of points to add. I mean, I'll try and avoid the philosophical discussion around consuming more or less, although I certainly have a strong personal view on it. But I think it is very hard to get companies to advocate for using them less. But just to give us an example, in my industry of carbon credits, it's actually have become a necessity. Because although the product itself is inherently a good one, and you can argue that in many cases for the shipping industry as well, the responsible use of that product is so ever important. And I have had to therefore take the highbrow stand that we have to advocate strongly for when is carbon credits used responsibly and when are they just greenwashing. And obviously that has the potential to limit my business, but I think ultimately it's the only way my industry can survive if we bring that in there. The other thing I wanted to make about this carbon footprinting here, perhaps not fully interesting for these people here, but I think carbon footprinting on products is going to be the next things in the same way as we see calories on our products today. I think it's going to happen. I think Singapore is doing some really interesting things in an aspect here. And when that happens, it's inevitable that people will start to care about where the products come from and how will they ship from port to port. So it's going to be driven by consumers eventually, I think.
So a ship responsibly campaign is what we need, with a 1-800 hotline for abuse, and then as a start. But will this transition mean higher prices then for the customers, or is it enough to have awareness through CO2 emission data on the products, or how do you see that going about? How do we? I mean, awareness is price as well, right? What's going to happen there, Peter?
In a perfect world, we're trying to make up for it by more planning, which is not really one of the best features that shipping has had. Consolidation and planning is difficult because the stakeholders are still not fully integrated, and that is also becoming obvious when we listen to the presentations here. When you look at ports, for example, right? Of course, when you have representatives of Singapore and Rotterdam here, these are highly tacticized places that can exchange data. But we go to 147 active ports. So some of them, they hardly have a fax machine, right? So if we would know early enough how many days jam there is to unload a vessel, and we would have a more efficient integration to our voyage planning, then we could save a lot of things. So I think that is very interesting for us to finally break down those walls between the silos to make these stakeholders also in more difficult locations speak to each other. Not only look at, okay, liner service is driving this at the moment, and that's very good, and I think we're trying to learn from it, but 70% of our vessels are tramping vessels, so they can go to any place in the world. So we have to look at this optimization. If you really have this information at hand and it's integrated into your system, in your planning, you can actually talk to the charterers. You can make a lot of choices. You can choose the safest voyage, you can choose the fastest voyage, you can go around crisis areas or bad weather. So there's a lot of smart decisions that could be taken if the systems were integrated with each other. But I can see that now for the first time, I think there's a lot of initiatives that target this way.
Yeah, Mikkel, you have a comment?
No, I was going to respond to the question, but no, I can come in on the question later on.
Well, I think the consumer has to pay for this. I think we can dance around the subject. I think there's plenty of opportunities the different elements of the supply chain can do to reduce cost in all elements and so on. But, you know, for a long time, and now it is getting philosophical, we've been taking out value from the earth without paying it back. And I think at some point that comes back. The question is, where does it come back, right? Does it come back with the prices of product going up, or does it come back through taxes? Does your insurance bill goes up because there's more and more weather events? The bill will arrive, and I think that's important. I don't think we can work our way through this and assume that it's not going to happen. The question is, how do we minimize it best possible, and how do we grow? And I actually think the next question about how do we actually start that journey is a critical one, because who's going to be the first ones? There's going to be some people making some investments where the returns initially might not be there. I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think we've heard that from the other panels here today as well. How should we, again, this around creating that collaborative environment, creating the incentives, supporting the early adopters and so on? I mean, what would you like to see happen the next 1 to 2 years?
Well, I like to see shipping companies come together and agree on what is good enough, because I think, being slightly controversial around this, it is unrealistic to see decarbonization happening as fast as perhaps the most activist people would like it to happen. And the problem is that shipping companies are being played out against each other. So there is no right or wrong answer. Call them science-based target, or call them what you want to, that absolutely dictates what must happen and what is too expensive and what not too expensive. So I think what shipping companies should do is that you come together, agree on what is the pathway under science-based targets, which is realistic, and then agree that if we are ambitious as companies, we have to allow those parties in the whole value chain that can best sequester some of that carbon to make up for the rest. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that the problem always have is, could you do a little bit more as an individual shipping company? Sure you could, but the marginal cost of abatement becomes so very, very high. But not many people understand that on the other side of the equation. They will just look at you and say you haven't decarbonized fast enough. But if the industry comes together and says, this is what much we can realistically do, and for the rest of it, and I know I'm being an advocate of my own product here, but for that we will honestly try and sequester that through paying someone else to do that for us. That's not an avoidance situation. That's not to try and do too little, because it's voluntary. But that has never been communicated well enough, and therefore is still being misunderstood on the other side as you trying to buy your way out of forgiveness. But it happens because there is no concentrated effort in trying to understand what is good enough look like.
Sarah, what would you like to see happen the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think there absolutely needs to be some sort of incentivization and support, and whether that's the bunkering infrastructure or the cost of the fuel, I think there needs to be some sort of industry incentivization or even at a regulatory level, just to promote and stimulate those early adopters.
So from what we would like to see happening, what would you like to see stop from happening the next couple of years? Something that's going on today in the industry that you think should be changed or stopped?
Well, actually, as a customer of the container shipping companies, I actually think a lot is being done. I want to give a little bit of credit to the shipping lines on this. I think what both Singapore is doing and what Bo and his team are doing in Copenhagen, kind of looking across industries, trying to find solutions and so on, I think are right. So I actually think we are moving in the right direction. The thing that I'm missing is the absence of data on a level playing field, right? So what is the quality of data? How can we trust it? Same goes for carbon credits, right? There's a lot of carbon credits out there. Some of them are good, some of them are horrible. So how do we get to the point where data and visibility, traceability is clearer? And I don't think it's ill will from anyone. I think it's just as an industry to work better on that collaboratively to give us that visibility across the supply chain.
Also a lot of public understanding. I think how to fill these words with life, and is there enough rainforest to save in the world as a counterbalance and things like that. I think it's not visual enough yet for people to understand. Same as it's not yet clearly quantified, and that the tools that we have, I think, for analysis are not yet developed enough for us on an operational basis. But I think that's all in the process of being discussed.
So in summary, we lack a little bit of work to be done on the data side and then transparency. Figure out a way how we translate and monetize this into a number that ultimately should end with the consumer one way or the other. Stimulate collaboration and maybe on the legal side as well, so we get the incentives running towards the shipping companies, so that can help translate and get the chain reaction going. Is that a good summary of the discussion here?
It's probably easier said than done, but I think it's a good summary.
Good, but then I'll round off here and then just open the floor if there are any questions that we see unanswered. Then I can activate just them in one go, but otherwise, thank you everyone. There was just one last one here coming in from an offset perspective. At what points do ship owners offset their emissions if they do it at all? Would having a tool to commoditize emissions be an added advantage before the ships are fixed?
I guess that one could be for me. So this is a question I get a lot. At what point in time is it okay to use offsets? And the point to be made here is that as long as you have a decarbonization strategy that is robust and potentially it's a science-based targets one, then anything you do above and beyond that puts you in the category of high ambition. Because actually, if everybody did what they were meant to do by 2050, then we would be within our budget. Reality is that not everybody will do that. So hence, ambitious company will take actions to use carbon credits before they reach that time. And they should be proud of it. And I say this because, of course, if they use the right type of credits, because that is an added thing that they do. And it's not realistic to get a company to pay $350 to abate a cost if at this point in time it's making them uneconomical. Then the question is, would having a tool for commoditized emission be added advantage before ships are fixed? I'm not entirely sure what that means, but obviously if you're meaning carbon credits to be commoditized, I'm not sure that's what the question is implying, then absolutely that's the point. The point here is that without liquidity in this system, then there will be no real price points for these things. There will be no accurate measurement of what the right price for carbon sequestration is. Not entirely sure that's what is meant here, but otherwise I can clarify whoever asked the question offline.
All right, nothing more in the pigeonhole, so thank you very much everybody, and thanks to the crowd for submitting the questions to stimulate the discussion here, so thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Rasmus, and our distinguished panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give them a big hand, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for asking the questions on Pigeonhole as well.